In CSS, there is a property called position, and there are a number of values associated with that property, but there are three main ones that are used quite common and are very powerful. And I'm going to cover that in this video right now. So I created a new file called positioning.html in my CSS folder here. And I added the basic structure as usual, linked it up to stylesheet.css. And then I added the idea of positioning to the body tag, a container element, the idea of container, and a level 1 heading, CSS positioning. And in the CSS, stylesheet.css, I added just some basic styles here to get started. Feel free to pause and copy that so you can get up to speed. We have the idea of positioning in the background of 1B4E5E, kind of a blue color in the back there. And I'm making the container white with padding of 20, just so it looks good while we're working through this lecture here. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create some boxes here. So I'm just going to add a level 2 heading, and I'm going to say relative position. Let's use level 3 because that's a little bit large. In fact, let's go back to level 2 and just restyle that level 2 heading on this page because it's just a little bit too big. So position, I'm going to style the H2 there, and let's say font size 15 pixels, 14 pixels. Actually, this should be positioning H2, and then let's make that font size 18 pixels. Okay, so we have relative position, and then we're going to add a div, give it the ID of box, give it the ID of relative, and then the class of box. And then I'm just going to say relative inside this text here. And then I'm going to copy this 2 more times. And that should be right here. Okay, now I'm just going to change this to absolute. The ID will also be absolute, and then the text will be absolute. And then the last one will be fixed. ID of fixed, and the text will say fixed. Okay, so right now we just have some basic text in the browser, but we want to make those actually look like boxes so we can see a visual representation of what we're doing here. So let's go ahead and style the box class in CSS. And I'm going to make it a background of DB4 E3E. And I want to change the color of the text to white. And I'm going to give it a height of 200 pixels and a width of 200 pixels. And just a couple other housekeeping things here. I'm going to say text align center. And then a cool trick you can do here is actually give the line height. Remember this property we talked about a little while back. You can give it the same height, the line height of the box, and it will be vertically centered. So 200 pixels line height. So now we have the text vertically centered and horizontally centered. A couple other things. I'm going to say text transform, uppercase, and then font family. I want it to be just Helvetica. And then font size, let's just go for something really small, 14 pixels. And then font weight, bold. Okay, there we go. So we just have some nice simple boxes here. And what we're going to do is play around with them, and I'm going to show you what relative, absolute, and fixed position do. So currently they all flow within the normal, they all kind of fall into the normal flow of the content. We just have some text, and we have a bunch of block level elements. The level 2 heading, box, level 2, box, level 2, box. And they just flow just vertically down the page in a normal flow. Now, what you can do is you can modify the position literally on the page. You can move the box around anywhere using positioning. And let's start with relative position. So I'm going to select that ID of relative. And I'm going to give it the position property of relative. So nothing happens right now, but currently the position is now relative. What you could do now, you have access to a couple properties, actually 4 properties, you can use to manipulate where you want this this box to be positioned. So you can select the top value property, and the value is numerical. So you can use pixels, percent, so on and so forth, but pixels is quite common. So you could say you want to move it 10 pixels down the page, and you saw that move there. The position of the box is moving relative to the top left corner of the box, and that's for all of these positions. It's going to be in relation to the very top left corner. So I moved this 10 pixels down from the top left corner. When you say left, and you say 10 pixels. Now we moved it 10 pixels to the right by saying the left is moved 10 pixels. Hopefully that makes sense. And I'll just play around with this a bit more just to show you. If I were to say negative 10, I now moved it negative 10 pixels from the left side. Let's say 50. Negative 50. You see how that moved? Negative 50 pixels from the top left corner. Now what if I said top 50? You could see how that's moved. What if I said negative 50 on the top? You see how that's moving around? Now when I change these values, they kind of move around depending on where you move it. And so that's relative positioning. You can use that to fine tune where you want things positioned, or if you want a cool layout and you want the sidebar to be just outside of the container a bit, but it's still within the flow of the content. It's just a cool little style trick. Now, absolute positioning is a bit trickier and kind of interesting. So now if I were to say position absolute, let's watch what happens. Something crazy happened here. It looks like the container collapsed. I'm going to temporarily remove this fixed position box just so you can see. You can see that now the container, the box is sitting outside of the container element. And that's because absolute positioning takes the content out of the flow of the page. So now the page has no idea that this element exists. It simply does not exist as far as this container is concerned. And that's kind of the point, because now what you can do, you have more flexibility on where you want to move this element. And so basically, the absolute position moves depending on what its parent container's position is. So you'll find out pretty quickly by saying top 0, and left 0 is a good way of doing it too. So because there are no other elements that are positioned that are wrapping around the absolute box, it will default to the body. Now let me try and explain that a little bit more simply. If I were to give the container element, so up here, which does not have any specifically set positioning, the position of relative, see what happens? The absolute box now sits in the top left corner of the container. And why is that? That's because now the container element has a position of relative, and the container is the parent element of the absolutely positioned element. So it will move in reference to its parent that has a position. And the container could have a position of absolute as well. It would mess with the position of the container, but it still will reference based on what the parent container's position is. And if I'd say this absolutely positioned element, what if I wanted it referenced from the bottom? It's going to go from the bottom corner of the body. Or what about the right? It's going to go to the bottom right. You see how that happens? Now I'm going to throw that fixed position back in here. And you can see absolute position, the H2 is still sitting there, but the box is gone because it's gone. It's out of the flow of the content. The container doesn't know it's there. That's kind of the point of absolute positioning. Fixed position is a bit different, where you give it the position of fixed, obviously, and it does this funny thing similar to the absolute position. It takes it out of the flow, but it fixes it on the screen wherever you hard code the position, the top, left, right, or bottom. And if I were to scroll, let me make the height of this container really high so we have a scroll bar. I'm just going to say height 2000 pixels. Now if I were to scroll, do you see how that fixed box stays there? So that's what fixed positioning does. And you can see that it just stays there. Now if I were to move the the position, let's say position bottom 10 pixels, and then right 40 pixels. Actually, let's go left 40 pixels. Now, if I were to scroll, it stays in that position on the screen. So it's relative to the screen, to the actual viewport of the browser, rather than the absolute position where you could see it's going to the bottom right corner of what's visible in the body. And unless I were to say container was going to have position relative or absolute, this absolute box will sit relative to the body. But when I scroll down, you can see that the fixed container stays there in its position. And that's kind of the idea with fixed position elements. A lot of web developers and web designers will use fixed position sidebars. So if you wanted it, let's say, let's go right 100 pixels and top 100 pixels. Let's say that was a sidebar. It will stay there beside the content no matter how long it is, and it kind of just keeps it fixed there. And so that's the idea with fixed positioning. And so there we have our relative position, our absolute position, and our fixed position boxes.